Welcome to Writer's Life, an ongoing conversation with writers, authors, and folks in the production and publishing industry. I'm your host, Marvel Harrison, Publishing Director, Mimbres Press of Western New Mexico University. It's a pleasure to share a conversation today with Kathleen McCleery, an award-winning broadcast journalist who has worked for PBS and NBC News during her 4-decade career. As a special correspondent and freelance producer for the PBS NewsHour, she reported occasionally on stories from a wide variety of topics, including politics, environment, education, all of those wonderful things that we at Writer's Life are interested in. She now lives in New Mexico, and prior to that, she was the program's debut executive director. Kathleen taught journalism at her alma mater, Princeton University, and in 2016 and 18, she focused on media coverage of the US elections. Welcome to Writer's Life, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Marvel. It's really nice to be here. I really appreciate the chance to kind of chat a little bit about at least what I've done. Hopefully it'll be of some interest. As you said, I was hired by the NewsHour. I was actually hired by them in November of 2005 as a producer. And I was hired on a 1-year contract simply to cover the 96 elections. They needed extra people to do that. And I worked for them for 18 years. And as you said, I ended up being the deputy executive producer. So in the end, the last 8 years of my tenure on staff, I was handling the daily program. I was in charge of both of the editorial content, the timing, coordinating graphics, all kinds of things. But my first job there at the NewsHour anyway was as a producer. So maybe people don't necessarily know what a news producer does, and they're all a little different. But from my perspective, what a producer does is works with a correspondent to formulate a story. So that means sometimes pitching the story, but once being assigned to that story or getting a green light, then following through and finding the characters, finding the locations, finding the visuals that are going to help you make that story, pre-interviewing them, doing all kinds of coordination, whether it's finding a camera crew, figuring out a flight or a hotel, getting everybody together. That's a huge piece of it. Can the interviewee and the correspondent and the producer and the cameraman all be in the same place at the same time? And then once all the material is gathered, to screen that and begin to write a story. And the writing is key. Some correspondents want to do that themselves, but a lot of times, many times, they rely on a producer to write the first draft. And then the two of them work together. A lot of times it's the producer who says, you know, I know you want to say that, but we don't have any pictures to cover that. And this is television. So if you need pictures, if you want to say that, you need the pictures to do it. So that's kind of what a producer does. I thought maybe what I would start with is one of the last big interviews that I produced. I've ended up producing, not interviewing, but producing interviews with presidents from Carter to Obama. And it's the Obama one that was particularly fun because it was one of the last things I did. It was in the last couple of weeks of my time on staff at the NewsHour. The person who normally did those kinds of things, who's a dear friend of mine, was actually out of the office. And so Gwen came to me in the newsroom. I'm sitting in the center of the newsroom because I'm handling the daily show. And she said, hey, Kathleen, you want to do this one at the White House with me? And of course, I jumped and said, you bet. Of course, I want to do that. And so we worked together. And in that case, a lot of it, of course, is all coordinated between the White House and it was what they call a group interview. There were 6, not all at the same time, but 6 correspondents who were going to interview Obama that day. And we each had 8 minutes. And so there were certain parameters that were being set for us. But because we're PBS and we didn't pay as much into the pool, that interview is done in one place and it's brought back to our studios on lines, we get to be last. Well, we're last, but we're the first to go on the air. Most of those national programs go on the air at 6:30 Eastern time. We went on the air at 6 o'clock. They all have offices in Washington, D.C. PBS has its office across the river, which means you get to fight rush hour traffic to get back there. Add to that, this was the first day that Judy and Gwen were anchoring the program officially alone. Jim had turned the program over to them. So I'll just share my screen for a second here. Hold on one second. There we go. Just to show you a shot of the of Obama. There you can see Obama, and we're in the green room of the White House, and that was from the interview. Anyway, but in order to get to this point, Obama was really late, and that was a problem because we were hanging out in what's called the East Room, and you're probably familiar with the East Room. This is a picture of Gwen and me. I think you can see it, right? East Room, and we're just waiting because Obama tended to be late, and we're hanging around. And Gwen at one point says to me, would you take a picture of all 6 of the correspondents and tweet it out? So I took this picture and I tweeted it out. And of course, I have like 2.5 Twitter followers. I'm not really particularly fluent on Twitter. And I tweeted it out with something really anodyne, like Gwen Ifill and other correspondents wait to interview President Obama. And Gwen,
I like that part, and other correspondents.
right. And Gwen says, oh no, come on, I'll retweet that. So she retweets the photo, and what she says is, what's with Wolf's other hand? So take a good look and you can see. Anyway, that was particularly funny. Then we go into the interview itself. I'll put that picture back on for just a second. And it goes on. And since we're last, by the way, I'm sitting when the other correspondents are in the interview, and I'm timing them. How long does it take Wolf to walk from the East Room, and then you have to go through another room into the green room and have his 8 minutes, say hello, and then have his 8 minutes, and then walk back. And then I'm calculating how long it's going to be before we go in, and how long it's going to be before we get to this back to the studio where she has to anchor the very first program. Well, it's getting later and later and later, and I had brought with me this little button. I don't know if you can see this.
I can. Yes, that's good.
So we finally get into the interview, and it's going on and on and on. And my job at this point is simply to hold up a time card that tells Gwen how much time she has left. And when it gets down to a minute, they're still chatting away. And of course, he knows Gwen. She's written a book about him. And he's said everything 5 times already. So he's faster, and she gets in more questions, and he doesn't want to stop. And the White House aides are looking at me like, you got to stop. It's over. And I'm looking back, giving them the look of, I'm not interrupting the president of the United States. No, thank you. And so finally it's over. And Gwen stands up and she introduces me to the president. And I say hello. And then I slipped her this button, one of these buttons, and she gives it to Obama, and he puts it on. And she turns around and looks at me, as it gives me this look like, nice going. And I give her a look like, we've got to get the hell out of here. And so she says goodbye. We leave, we go walking through to the East Room. We had both worn heels into the interview, but we both had flat shoes in our bags. And we literally kicked off our heels, threw on our flat shoes, and we went running out of the White House. And she was running ahead of me. And she turns around at one point and she looked at me and she said, they only shoot people when they're coming in. They never shoot people going out. Anyway, it
sounds like it was really wonderful to work with Gwen specifically.
Gwen was one of the best. She really was, because she really did her homework, number one. But number two, she was so straightforward when she offered a criticism. So there are a lot of people who, I'm not going to name any names, but there are a lot of people who would make you feel badly because you made some sort of a mistake. And if Gwen didn't like something you wrote, she would simply say, that doesn't work for me. Let's work on it. And you never felt like you'd made this terrible, terrible mistake.
Well, what she did so appropriately was she made it about herself. That doesn't work for me. Right. It's not like what you wrote is wrong.
Right.
And I think that's one of those things that I think especially women can learn from, that there is a tactful way to interface with someone.
Right, exactly. And she just had a wonderful way of doing it. I miss her terribly. But so Obama was the last. I never produced an interview with Donald Trump, but I did produce interviews with all of the rest of them. Not necessarily when they were in office. I think the one with Jimmy Carter was after he'd written a book. The one with George H.W. Bush was at the 96 convention. That was very early on in my tenure at the NewsHour. By the way, that 1-year contract got extended to being on staff after a year. And then I did one with Clinton, which was at the very, very beginning of his tenure as president. And that was part of a documentary series called Challenge to America that I produced with Hedrick Smith. And there were 3 hours. It was about economic and educational challenges in the US, Germany, and Japan. And I was in charge of the US segment, and then, which was an hour. And then the interview with Clinton, which was also an hour. I will, let's see if I'll share one picture there if you'd like to see it.
That was in the 90s when Japan was still the issue.
Yep.
Unlike, 25 years later, China becomes
right.
the counterpoint.
Yeah, and it would be wonderful to do a documentary about China. So, but here's the picture in the Oval Office. This interview was done in the Oval Office, and Clinton really had a reputation for being late. He was late for absolutely everything, and including this. And this was back in the 90s, and we had a huge amount of equipment and a big crew, and I had allowed 3 hours of setup time for this interview. And we stood on the porch outside of the Oval Office for most of that time. I think we ended up, when we finally got in, we had 25 minutes to set up, and we just worked as quickly as we could. And then the interview was done. And Hedrick Smith is a former New York Times correspondent and author, who's done a lot of things for PBS, asks a zillions of questions. I mean, his interviews are always long. And so he went way, way over. So when it was finished, I said to the crew, okay, snap to it, guys, get everything cleaned up, get it all outside. This is the Oval Office. We got to let the president do his job. And Clinton was hanging around, and we're like, what's he doing? And finally, he looked at us and he said, don't any of you guys want to take the picture? And the picture being the White House photographer takes a picture of the president, and this is the picture, which I find kind of amusing because there I am smack in the center in this rather crazy dress. But anyway.
Well, Kathleen, you stand out next to Clinton.
He was a character. He loved chatting with the crews. He would go on and on and on. But anyway, the other one that is kind of fun, I think, is the interview we did with Ronald Reagan, which was in the beginning of his second term. It was in 1985. And I was working on a documentary about the Gridiron Club. Maybe everybody doesn't know what the Gridiron Club is, but it was the 100th anniversary of the Gridiron. And it's a group of journalists who get together and have this big dinner in which they poke fun at themselves and politicians, often in song and dance, kind of crazy acts, if you will. And they had never, ever allowed television cameras in to cover anything that they had done. In fact, it took them a long time to include any, well, first of all, Blacks and women, but secondly, radio and television journalists. But in 1985, they allowed one of their members, Charlie McDowell, who was a reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, whom I knew because he had been on Washington Week in Review for many years with one of my mentors, Paul Duke. And Charlie had great access, of course. And so we produced this documentary. It was great fun. But in doing that, Reagan was interviewed. And we interviewed Reagan, I think it was in the map room at the White House. Because one reason was because Reagan had gone to every dinner while he was in office. But secondly, because his wife had performed and she had done, they would take songs, and she took secondhand rows. And of course, she'd been known, and they made it secondhand clothes. And she was known for her attire and, her designer outfits. So anyway, I will play you. I hope this works well. I'm going to optimize for video and hope that works. And this is old footage, so bear with me. And I hope you can. It's just a real short clip of the interview with Reagan.
Washington insiders have been meeting like this at gridiron dinners since 1885. Every president since Grover Cleveland has attended at least one. Franklin Roosevelt came to 11. President and Mrs. Reagan have been to all 5 dinners since he was elected. This is a president who takes parody in stride. He and Mrs. Reagan feel at home at the dinner and even on the gridiron stage. We talked to the Reagans at the White House about their perspective on the gridiron. Mr. President, you've attended every gridiron dinner since you came to Washington. Why does a chief of state go to such a regal affair to be given a hard time?
Self-defense.
I just,
Washington
oops,
insiders have been.
sorry. So self-defense. I love the answer. But we had great clips of the various songs. It was really fun.
That sounds wonderful. I mean, what a remarkable career. And just briefly before we wrap up, how did you initially even get into the world of, I mean, with your production, you end up being a writer, coordinator, a project manager, a travel agent. I don't know. You did it all, but how did you initially, what prompted you way back when?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is I always loved public speaking. When I was in high school, I did debate, I did public speaking. When I got to college, I worked at the radio station. I interned at the local PBS station while I was in college. And I was able to use the alumni network and found a job few months. It was 1975 was a terrible time to be looking for a job, but found a job at WETA, the flagship PBS station in the Washington, D.C. area, as a production assistant, absolutely lowest on the totem pole, but it got me in. And from there, produced a whole variety of things. And I guess for me, it's all about the story. You know, it's all about finding those characters and the locations and the stories. And I'd love to be able to tell you sort of my all-time favorite story if we have time.
We do. Go ahead.
Which comes from a documentary I did in 1988, that long ago. It was called The Great Upset of 48, and it was about the Truman-Dewey election. And we found the train that Truman had used to the whistle stop campaign. We found a lot of people, because 40 years later, there were quite a few who were still alive, like Clark Clifford and Dewey's personal secretary. At one point, I found a man who had worked for Truman as a young aide. His name was George Elsey, and I had lunch with him in Washington, D.C. And in the course of lunch, he said to me, you know, Truman always knew he was going to win. And I said, well, how did you know that? And he said, well, because I was on the train in October of 1948, and we sat in the dining car of the train, and Truman had a piece of paper, and he wrote down on the paper the names of the states he was going to win and the number of electoral votes. And he showed it to me. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. Elsey, do you still have that piece of paper? And he said, yes. And I said, will you come to Florida? The train's in a train museum outside of Miami. Will you come to Florida with me, sit in the dining car where you sat? My correspondent, Paul Duke, will sit where Truman sat, and you'll tell us that story? And he said, yes. So let me just show you another short clip of that what George Elsey told us.
All I can say is that Harry Truman was absolutely certain he wasn't going to be out of a job.
So much so that in mid-October, he sat down in the dining car of the Ferdinand Magellan with aide George Elsey and predicted the outcome. Elsey jotted it down.
He said, I'm going to give you the states. So as fast as I could write, he rattled off the 48 states with the electoral college vote, and he came up with an electoral count for himself of 340 with 108 for Dewey. And that was his perception in the middle of October of how the election was going to come out.
So anyway, you can see it was just great fun. It was just one of those moments you felt like you struck gold. And it's continued to happen for me. So now what I do for the NewsHour is I produce and report stories on a very occasional basis. Sometimes I work with a correspondent, and that person is the one you see on the air. Sometimes it's a story that I've pitched and I'm reporting it. And for me, I'll tell you the difference between those two things, I think, is makeup. And because I end up doing a lot of the same things when I'm doing a story. And probably the one that kind of sticks in my mind now, because the Ukraine war is still going on, is the story that I did from right here in New Mexico, from Montezuma, New Mexico, with the United World College. And I don't have a clip, but this is just the screenshot that we had from the day that this went on the air on NewsHour weekend. It aired on Easter Sunday, but it shows this young woman, Masha. And again, just like the Truman aide, Masha, I knew Masha had a story. And if I could convince her to tell it, that was going to be really powerful. And in fact, I met her beforehand, and that's sometimes really critical, is that sort of pre-interview time period. I met her beforehand and she agreed. I kind of convinced her to let us film her calling her parents back in Ukraine to see if how they were doing. And she said something to me in the course of that interview, which we used in the piece. She said, whenever I call them, I want to be sure they're still alive and safe. And that was just a heart-wrenching moment. So it's that kind of thing that we're looking for, is to pull it all together.
And Kathleen, that piece you did on the World College, and specifically that wonderful Ukrainian young woman, was fabulous. And I encourage our listeners to, our viewers to be able to see that. And we'll put a link to that with this so that people can find it easily. But, it has been a joy to speak to you today, Kathleen, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. I'm Marvel Harrison, and from all of us at Mimbres Press, may your day be sparked with curiosity and wonder. We'll see you on the next Writer's Life.
Thank you so much. I love the curiosity and wonder.